Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And I have a cold.
You do. I
do.
noticed that.
It's like really deep in my chest. So I'll try to like turn my head if I have to hack. But
Well, it'll give that nice homey, you're right here with us
You're
feel.
right here with us. Bring me some hot tea. Couple quick things before we jump into this story. Once again, I want to mention Nils in our Facebook group, primarily because he posted, I believe it was yesterday, that now that he's heard his name twice, he now has been spoiled and he expects to hear it every time. So for no other reason than that, just to make Nils smile, I'm going to say his name again today.
Well, I think that there are two things I have to say. One is the ask and you shall receive feature of our Facebook group. But the second thing is, I think that now there is pressure on Nils to bring other Swedish countrymen.
I'm not sure we have to stop at Sweden. Can't he just be in charge of Europe?
Well, he can be in charge of Europe, which is a hell of a promotion, I have to say. But I think that he now knows how we treat Swedes here on our podcast. And I think that puts some pressure on him, frankly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you want to jump on in to our Facebook group, and I'll give you another reason why to here in a second, you can find us on Facebook. The SHMS podcast community is one way to find it, or you can go to the So Here's My Story Facebook page, and there's a link right there under the main picture that says visit the group or join the group or something like that. Check out the group. I don't know. You can figure
something.
Whatever the verb is.
It has
says
a word,
the word group.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a button. So click it. Very soon, you'll be able to get there even more easily from our brand new website, but it is not quite up yet. So it might be by the time this actually airs, but not future version of the world that might be up by now, but not quite. Do pop in there, because one thing we're going to be doing, we're going to be adding a segment, I believe, in between a couple other second segments that we're going to be adding with answering some listener questions. So if there's any question you have, whether it's a follow-on to a particular story, whether it's just a random question about, I don't know, if you want to know what Elliot had for breakfast.
Which so many people do, and it would be nice to get all of those requests in one place.
Yeah, just so we can be efficient about it. So pop on in there. That will be the place that we source the questions. So join in on the group, post your questions. And if you haven't had a chance to check out our, I guess I'll call it our bonus episode, our unreleased episode, our
hidden episode
that made our intern blush when she found it on the recorder that we thought we deleted. If you text the word story to 345-345, you can shoot us your email and then we can send you that episode. So jump on in.
Yeah. And the feedback that we're getting is people find it pretty interesting. So
it's a great episode. I was bummed that we didn't feel like we could release it in the first place. So I'm really glad we didn't delete it like we thought we did.
Yeah.
So do you want to thank our sponsors? And then we'll jump on in.
I do. Want to thank Tom Loveland of Mind Over Machines, Cat's Copy, the architecture firm of GWWO, and Marycraft Staffing and HR Solutions. Thank you.
Okay, so here's my story, and I'm going to do a better job at telling it than I did last week.
So you're going to like finish sentences? And,
I'm going to have verbs and like clauses.
Direct objects?
Periods.
Wow.
Yeah, no. Well, actually, I can promise none of that. But,
but it's aspirational.
But I'm going to try. So here's the way I'm looking at it. Last week's story was so like rambly and forming in my head as I told it that it can't be worse than that. So it's up from here.
I love the low bar strategy. So go ahead.
All right, so here we go. The 3 times in the past couple weeks this has happened, and it's been a kind of almost like forming hypothesis in my head for a while, but then it's just been bam, 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 evidence that this is a thing. And I think it's so interesting, and I want to see if you think it's interesting or if I'm just a crazy scientist about how I look at these things. So a couple different examples where, and this is not unusual for me, I've joked about couples, business couples therapy, where one of the things that I step in for is where 2 very important people in a company are not getting along to a point that it is causing, really not good things to happen in the organization. So, I get called in to work on those things. And so that is not unusual for me. But what I have noticed is the frequency with which, there's absolutely that interpersonal, bone on bone, no cartilage between them anymore, where both people are not assuming best intentions of the other person. They are assigning intent with assumptions about why somebody said something or didn't do something instead of being curious. All sorts of like just bad interpersonal conflicts. But what I have noticed is how often all three of these organizations were growing organizations, often rapidly growing organizations, and how often what that interpersonal tension and conflict was really pointing to is actually an operational issue that is like bubbling up and making it impossible for you to ignore it via this interpersonal thing. But so you still have to deal with the interpersonal piece of it, but that is not the only problem, that it's actually unveiling, or like revealing is maybe a better word, a moment where something needs to change operationally. And I can, in one case, it was, there was, as they had grown really quickly, where the public could contact them when it was 100 or 150 people that came to their events. That was one thing. When suddenly it's 5,000 and you don't have any way to prioritize those requests or any kind of system for it. And then these two guys are butting heads about how you deal with it. There's two problems there to fix. One on the personal, but also the operational. And have you ever, like, that connection is really fascinating to me. And I'm just curious if you've seen that, or are these just a coincidence?
No, I see it all the time. And particularly, as you mentioned, in growing companies, because in a lot of companies that start out, the founders in particular can have their fingers in a lot of pies, and they know what's going on. Like, there was a time in my firm, I knew every single file, I knew every single client, I knew every single thing that was happening with every single file and every single client. And people would call me because my name's on the door, or I was the person they met, and I could actually answer things substantively and say, well, this is what we should do. This is what we should. And there came a time that I couldn't do that anymore. The firm grew, and I see that in a lot of companies. It grows to the point where the approach you had wasn't practical. And one of the things that I see that companies struggle with is their first reaction is that everybody just stay in their lane. Okay, you do this, I'll do this, and so, but you find you're working in silos. And so you cordon yourself off intentionally from part of the company. You're working in a silo, but all of a sudden something interrupts that, and you assume something's going on and it's not, and you lash out. And there's a conflict between working in silos and understanding your operational role, and making sure that there is an operational role and an overarching strategy. Because the mistake is we'll overcompensate by working in silos. Nobody knows what's going on. And so there is this bone-on-bone conflict when one rubs up against the other. But knowing your operational role is more org charty and understanding how the company works.
Right. And in these cases, there was something, the reason that this conflict was there was something that needed to be defined that was not currently defined. In one of the cases, it was exactly what you're saying. It wasn't clear, and no one it had never been important before to delineate who does what. I mean, I think we've used this metaphor before. It's that place where you have to move from, there's a certain part of founding something and growing it where you're like field medics, where you're just running out into the,
Right, it's triage.
Yeah, it's triage. Yeah. And like, okay, everybody does whatever needs to be done. And then there comes a point where you have to start being a little bit more like a surgical team. And that's not a Tuesday, you're one way, Wednesday the next. It's a very slow process. And I so often talk to people who have so much, it's a bit too strong of a word, but almost shame around finding themselves in these moments where something is undefined that needs to be defined, as if they've dropped the ball or fallen down, or when in fact, I don't know, I have not seen any other way to notice that other than to sort of swing the other way and too early and to too much of a degree try and define things. And then you're overstructured. Like I think putting structure around just what needs to be fixed or shored up or clarified, just enough structure to give you your freedom back or your ease back is at least in my opinion, the best way to get there. But I think it's so interesting to just even kind of have this awareness to say like, oh, these two people are butting heads. We absolutely have to deal with their communication skills and their ability to deal with each other and whatnot. But is there something else going on here? Like, do we have an operational issue that is making what would be a smaller interpersonal issue unignorable? Is it like, is the operational thing putting fuel on their conflict fire?
Well, sometimes when I talk to companies about operational things, well, I'll back up. When I talk to them about contracts, who has the authority to do something, and you know this, I'll ask them to answer the question, what can be done over your objection?
Yes.
And if the answer is nothing, that means I have a voice in everything.
Right.
So, and that may be your answer, and that's fine, but we can explore that. Operationally, one of the questions that I ask is, what question is asked to you where you would give the answer, I'm not the guy? So is there something, because when you start an organization, when it's small, virtually everything that comes up, you're like, sure, I can handle that. I can do this. I can do that. But there comes a point, and it's not just if operationally there does come a point, whether psychologically there's a point where you have the insight to know that you've reached it, where an issue comes up and you will say and are willing to say, I get the issue. I'm not the guy. You have to talk to her. You have to talk to him. Because that means that all of a sudden you've started making strides in defining an operational role that you're comfortable with, because you're excluding things that maybe you know about, maybe you have feelings about, maybe you have experience with, but you're not the guy. And if you can't answer any question with that I think is symptomatic.
Yeah, it's I often, I'm not it's funny. This is a kind of like in between space conversation for me, because I am not a big fan of hierarchy, at least not unnecessary hierarchy. I'm not just personally, I'm not much of I don't gravitate towards authoritarian structures and whatnot. Positional authority doesn't mean a lot to me, So that's kind of my come from as when I'm strategizing leadership in general. And there is a special kind of chaotic hell when you don't have enough structure. And I think of it as even dotted line structure, just enough structure to give you room to have all the freedom you want, but you have to have some kind of guardrails. And it's interesting because the thing that you're pointing out always makes me, when I see this, and it comes back to these interpersonal conflicts. There was that book, Eat, Pray, Love. There was a quote in there that I went ahead and just looked up, because otherwise I would have completely bastardized.
Taylor would understand this. I read part of it. I only got through Eat.
Good to know. Good to know. But in there, she has this quote about that all causes of war, grief, suffering all come back to two questions of how much do you love me and who's in charge? that those two questions of love and control are somewhere behind every war, if I think of even in a business world, it's not, we wouldn't always use the word love, but am I valued? Like, how much do you value me, and who's in charge? And who's in charge, that is the tricky thing, because it can so easily start to sound like those conversations. I think people get nervous about saying them because they can sound like a pissing match, like, well, I get to decide that. It's not. I feel like both sides, that game Operation, I feel like both sides of that conversation have like a bzzz, where it sounds like you're taking control, versus if you're letting it go too much, that causes problems too.
But the issue with who's in charge as a question is, to me, the primary downfall is the failure of nuance. So who's in charge, to me, implies of everything, meaning you can fire me, you can lower my salary, you can hire the next $500,000 a year person, you can close our company. When really, and that's why I go to, what can you do over my objection?
Yeah. Because
there are certain places that you are in charge, you're absolutely in charge, and certain places where, well, no, this is a consensus issue. Right.
Well, I worked with one company as they were doing a leadership transition to have somebody taking over the role of the founder as the CEO or whatever, president,
always
whatever you want to call it. I was going to say, always a fun thing. Let me take over mothering your baby.
Yes.
It's a very, as you can imagine, tensions. Everyone had the best of intent. I couldn't have asked for a team of people who were trying very, very solidly to do the right thing and be the right way in the conversation. And just no matter how you cut it, it's tricky. And so obviously the founder, who was not giving up control of the company, he was still owning it, really wanted to have, he couldn't just say like, hey, you guys do whatever you want, because he's still at 100% of the liability. It's still on him. But he obviously understood, like, you need to be able to make decisions and whatnot. And that is what they were really butting heads on, was trying to, they weren't making space for the nuance of it. And I think nuance can often be thought of as kind of a mushy word of like, oh, it's undefined. I think you can have definition within fluid space, kind of. So in there, just to make a very easy example, take something like marketing. Whatever, she wanted to be able to make some decisions about like how they market and where they go to or whatever. Well, in his mind, he's like, well, I don't want her just being able to, do whatever. What if she blows $10 million on, I was like, do you really think she would? He's like, well, no, of course not that. I was like, okay, well, let's be specific about the fear. You don't really think she would spend every dime the company owns on average. He's like, well, of course not. Of course not.
No, but he can set a budget and say,
that's what, thanks for ruining my story, Elliot.
I'm sorry, but that's where it is. That's the space you operate in. Within this, you can choose peas, carrots, lima beans, or whatever. You have to eat a vegetable, but whatever
you have to eat a vegetable. Yeah. I'll tell you who did a great job of this. And it's a pretty well-known story, is the Ritz. They have this, the Ritz has this whole structure of where any employee can do these, like, I think they call them like, there's some fancy name for it that they use, of, or I can make your day extra special if I see an opportunity. Like, if you don't have your shoes, I can make sure I can buy you a pair of shoes. And it's interesting because there was a period, as I understand the story, where that was the statement. And it was reinforced over and over and over again. You can go buy shoes. You can go buy, you can do whatever you want to make a client. Well, because people didn't know where the operation game buzzer of like, well, that's not allowed. They ended up setting this, what sounds like a very high, very generous budget, where, at least when I heard this story from them at a leadership symposium, it was $1,200 a day that any employee could spend to make guests happy. And when people hear that, especially business owners, they're like, oh my God, my employees would bankrupt me. And they're like, no, pause. You have to be able to justify your decision. So if you're spending $1,200 every day on people, like, that's a conversation that you have of like, was that really the right decision? Did they need $1,200 shoes, or would they have been super happy with $50 shoes? So there's a conversation within there to keep it in the right space. But they decided on that number because there were circumstances where spending $1,000 was worth every penny, because you won the undying loyalty of an incredibly good customer or something. So they didn't want to make it too low. So I think those kind of putting structure around things, because, and here's why I think there is this connection to the interpersonal things, is because if you don't have these right operational structures, and whether they're clarity of who can make decisions, or whether they're like processes that make decisions, the sort of off the top decisions, more clear because you systematize something, then people have to make assumptions about who's in charge, and a version of, do you love me? Like, do you not value my decision-making skills? And they have to have interpersonal conversations about priority choices. And I think that's why they intersect so much.
Yeah, no. And I do want to get back to the $1,200 a day and the worst fears, because as a business owner, you would see that the employees, if I have 5 employees and they spend $1,200 a day, and so that's $6,000 every single day. And if it's just work days, so you have 22 days in a month, and all of a sudden they're spending 120, whatever.
Right,
and so you start, or 12, you start doing the math, and it's just daunting. And it goes back to when I started EHP, the Empty Hourglass program, and I said that I just wanted people to be able to check in. And I said to my clients, it's a very low monthly fee, not hours, unlimited phone calls, unlimited emails. Yep. You'll never see a bill. And I was talking to members of the Maryland State Bar, the hierarchy, and they said, no, you know what? You're going to lose your shirt. And you're not going to be able to service these people. And there's going to be an uproar because you promised something you can't deliver, because unlimited phone calls.
They're going to call every day.
They're going to call every minute of every day.
Because they have nothing better to do than call and talk to your lawyer.
And they want to talk to the lawyer. I was listening to that, and I was like, no, there's no way it's going to be more like a gym membership when people join, and they're not going to go for months at a time, but they like knowing the gym's there in case they want to go. And so the worst fears about, that the maximum amount of latitude is going to be utilized every single day I've never seen that realized.
Right, right. So I'm curious. I would love to hear from you guys, the listeners. Do you see this correlation between interpersonal conflicts and operational ones? Maybe it's hard to see. Maybe you have a curiosity of like, here, this thing happened. Is there an operational piece there? I'd love to hear that. If you want to post in the Facebook group or send us a message on Messenger and Facebook. You can also email us at talktous@sohere'smystory.com. That's another way to get to us. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Have you seen, there's really two issues bubbling here that I would love to hear about. One, if you've seen this intersection of interpersonal and operational. And then also this concept that Elliot's especially pointing on here of being given latitude. Have you experienced places where you either have thought about giving more latitude or wish you had more latitude? We could really explore that on either way. It's funny. We keep talking about both ends of it. And I think maybe that's part of the important part, is because your empty hourglass is actually about not putting in too much structure.
Right.
And in some of the ways that some of the examples that I was coming to the table with beginning were when there's not enough. So it's like these, I think what we're kind of hitting on is finding your like the right amount of guardrails of structure that allow you to stay on the highway and go super fast without worrying about careening off the cliff to the left or the right, but not overdoing it.
Well, and I think part of the issue is figuring out what's the worst possible thing that happens and not creating an organization that prevents the worst possible thing from happening, but rather creating an escape hatch. If the worst possible thing happens, we can do this. So for EHP, for Empty Hourglass, if for some reason I had 75 clients that were calling every minute of every day and I realized, you know what, I tried to do this, but I'm not going to, it can't work. I'm not sentenced to life,
right,
to EHP. I could pull the plug. So it reminds me, and I've mentioned this before, of the John Nordstrom issue, which is in Nordstrom's as opposed to other department stores. You'll never see that sign near the dressing rooms that say customers are limited to 3 garments per visit to the dressing room.
Oh my God, it drives me crazy.
Because, and I read about an interview that he gave, and they asked why. They said, well, in retail, there's a certain amount of loss from theft or whatever. There's a loss factor. And you're going to have that in retail either way. But let's say, and it's a lot less than this, but let's say it's 2%. He says, now you're not going to be able to get that below 1.5%. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. Why am I going to create a policy that is going to inconvenience 98.5% of the customers who are great customers and paying customers and honest customers, just so I can maybe shave a little bit off of this 1.5% that's inevitable? And I see that with a lot of organizational choices. A lot of times policies are created in order to guard against that 0.01% chance of something bad happening. And in creating that policy or that structure, they eliminate the possibility of the great things happening. They cut down on the latitude, and they cause the kind of resentment and emotional backlash that results in, as you say, the bone on bone.
Well, you're pointing back to, I think it was maybe 2 episodes ago when we did on unintended consequences, that you put something in place, and you really have to pay attention to what are you incentivizing and wow. Try that again. What are you incentivizing and disincentivizing? Wow. Okay, I'm just going to skip it.
Okay, how about what are you incentivizing and then the other thing not?
And not incentivizing.
Yeah.
If I say it enough times, I won't even be able to say incentivize, because it's already starting to sound weird to me. Paying attention to the ripple effect of those things, and are they actually creating what you want or not? Because they might save you from loss, but are you actually also saving you from people buying way more stuff? Because they could take, nothing makes me, I don't like shopping anyway. I loathe shopping, and the whole trying things on just drives me crazy. So when I can only take in a few, and then I have to get like completely dressed again and go back out and exchange them for another few, and then it's just
right. And so they take you as a customer,
and I usually just leave.
That's exactly. Thanks for ruining my story, Jody. So they take you as a customer that had your checkbook out, and you're ready to go, and you just get frustrated. You're like, you know what? It's not worth it. I'll put it off for another day.
I can't do this today. Which, ding, ding, ding. amazingly takes me back to the very beginning. I think
an organized episode.
I know, almost. I see. I was determined to keep it on track. I think that is the thing. We also often separate the personal and then what feels like the science of business, the operations, the structures, without recognizing that those operational choices almost always have some kind of emotional rollout. So like that operational choice thing, it creates an emotional reaction in me about shopping. And then I make an emotional decision to say, screw it, I'm out of here because I'm tired of getting redressed 10 times. So I think that's especially, that's just a customer situation. So when you have people in the organization who are working together every day and these operational things pop up, I think part of why I got so excited about this issue is that, again, these interpersonal conflicts can often feel so like we're broken, like there's something wrong with us, or like, do we have to get rid of this person? Do we have to get rid of that person? And every time that I've been called into work on these, we've never had to get rid of the person. Like, not only have they been able to find their way back to a professional relationship, which reminds me of a quote I just saw recently that said, let's move away from this, there's no I in team, to teams are made up of nothing but I's that just want to fit in. I was like, yeah, exactly. Like they're often, almost always coming from a place of wanting things to go well. That's why there's conflict. If they didn't give a hoot, they wouldn't be so up in arms about things. But then the other reason it always tends to work out, and I can't promise it will always work out, but is because when we uncover these operational things over and over again, you shore up that operational flaw that's happening, or like need. And immediately it takes the pressure off of the thing that was causing the friction on the interpersonal side. They still need to have better skills with dealing with each other, but it's easier to deal with once you take off that, you can put that cartilage back in of a process that makes the thing smoother in the first place.
You can, but I think you have to deal with the personal side, the I's in team. And the way it is, for me, I've rarely seen a new operational rule handed down or a policy handed down without having some individuals on the team, some people on the team think to themselves or say out loud when they look at this new rule, what are you trying to say? What do you mean by that? And if you don't answer that question, they fill in the narrative. Oh, yeah. What we mean is you're not qualified to do this. Mm-hmm. Or what we mean is we don't trust you with this. And so you have to, I think the way of putting the cartilage back in is to acknowledge and address the I in team.
Absolutely. And one of the ways that I think that can be really fantastically done is, and what I've seen work is, and again, this doesn't always happen really perfectly magically, but a lot of times what I've noticed is that people have, the part of the problem is everyone's decision matrix is invisible to everyone else. And if you can make that invisible visible, and then this is the part that doesn't always work smoothly, but you can get there, create some agreement about how do we decide? What are we deciding by? That can help to take care of the I's, because people have had their perspective heard, and then they're working towards some kind of agreement on how do we decide on this. These operational things that I've been talking about from the beginning, every single one of them was something that's invisible, that just needs to be made visible so that everyone can have some shared agreement around, oh, okay, that's how we do things. But it always comes back to acknowledging the I's.
And so that, I would submit, is the name of this episode.
Acknowledging the I's.
Well, my suggestion was there is an I in team.
And I'm dyslexic, so that works out perfectly.
Excellent. So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group, as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.